Well, hey, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our Monday Mindshare this week. Last three Monday Mindshares, we've had this thread of fat oxidation and caffeine, and then culminated in the launch of our latest SFuels product, the SFuels Primed product. You know, the heritage at SFuels has been focused mainly on metabolic health, meaning focus on blood sugar optimization and trying to reduce these heightened spikes and crashes in blood sugar, and also improving the efficiency of fat oxidation, etc., and predominantly for the athlete. We're certainly extending our scope and addressing another spike as we come to see and understand more about it, and it's certainly problematic for health and well-being, and certainly around just how we feel, how our mood, if you will, our motivation and drive. And we're certainly excited to share a little bit of that today on what we're working on increasingly as we go into 2022 and beyond. Well, you know, I thought I'd just start with the heritage at SFuels, our company brand. What does the SF in SFuels means? Because I think it explains a little bit about how we can extend the utility and the role, the contribution that SFuels is making when you understand a little bit about where we've come from. Sometimes if we hear that, oh, what does that SF mean? And SF, is that San Francisco? Or as people learn a little bit about it, they say, oh, it must stand for sugar-free, which is closer. It has nothing to do with San Francisco. But it really began with our company focused on spike-free and the aspiration to, as we looked at that time, better blood sugar regulation, on creating products that would mitigate and have a positive effect on a more smoother blood sugar regulation. In fact, the initial registration of our company was Spike-Free Limited. And then the Go Longer aspect that we began 7 years ago was a subtitle, if you will, to our brand right from the beginning, and we've kept it ever since. And it really wasn't about just the performance in the moment of a race or a competition and going longer in that endurance race, but it was very much stead in the philosophy of the longevity of the lifestyle, and in the long run, ensuring that what we were supporting was health for the longevity of the lifestyles we love. And that is what has continued to be fundamental to our products and the ongoing development of the segments that we enter as we begin to create these new products at SFuels. So to that end, as we embark upon these new products for really everyday usage, and I'm not saying every day in that you have to use them every day, but the application of them is for, if you will, the everyday lifestyle. And as we said, our heritage is the bottom of this slide, more on blood sugar and insulin regulation. And part of that also that we saw a lot of literature around heightened blood sugar levels resulting in higher inflammatory mediators, et cetera, and looking to improve a lot of that, predominantly in the sports performance arena and endurance athletes. Well, what we are increasingly looking at is another spike that has detrimental effects to the well-being of people, and that is not just specific to athletes, but more so just generally people at large. And that is not just being well and being healthy, but the feeling of being well, the feeling of having a good outlook, mood, a motivation with drive. We seek for reward, and we seek for performance in our everyday lifestyles. And this all contributes. It's not the only element, and we'll talk about some of that in a second, but it contributes to certainly the state of happiness. And specifically around this is this spiking and crashing that we see in the general population of this neurotransmitter called dopamine. And it's associated, of course, with that feel-good, that mood, the pleasurable aspect of what comes with seeking for and realizing rewards. But what can happen, of course, is this can be stimulated high and it can crash and leave ourselves, if you will, with a very different feeling. And we'll talk more about that soon. But this particular neurotransmitter is quite vulnerable. And by vulnerable meaning the environment that we find ourselves in, and the changing environment we find ourselves in, the substances that we consume, and also the activities that we partake in. So let's touch a little bit about this. Before we do, though, I would just say that, look, well-being and the feeling of being healthy and having, an upbeat mood and a strong drive and motivation, it can't be ignored that there are foundations to our well-being before we start, if you will, working at the knobs on tuning a more balanced dopamine levels and baselines and flow within our bodies. Now, there are some basic foundations, obviously, to core health. These can't be ignored. You can't avoid these. And whether that's, exercise and how we handle stress, our social connectedness, these are critical things. Sleep, diet, exercise, just being outdoors in the sun. These are all critical aspects, and just a lot of literature can underwrite that these are, if you will, foundations. And what we're talking about with dopamine is more about on top of, or building upon these foundations in the spirit of improving our sense of well-being and our motivation, our drive, our mood, etc. Now, I want to give full credit and tribute to, I think, one of the most elegant researchers in this field, and by most elegant, the way that he has taken what is monumentally complex to a simple construct and provided that free through YouTube to consumers to be educated on. And this is Andrew Huberman's work at Stanford. And I'll make sure that I put the link to what I'm going to summarize a little of, just a fraction of what I think is one of his most masterful podcasts. Now, it is 2 hours in length, about dopamine and mindset and drive. But I just think it's a masterful piece of work. And frankly, a lot of people should consume this in the spirit of really understanding for themselves the role that this is filling in their own lifestyle. Now, a key tenet of his podcast and his research and his work talks a little bit about this relationship of this baseline of dopamine levels, and how different activities or change in the environment or substances that are consumed can elevate that dopamine level higher, and then it returns back to the baseline. But what he talks about is what's going on in today's lifestyle is different, if you will, aggregations of these different stimulants, of increasing the release of dopamine, compounding together that the magnitude of the elevation, the spiking, if you will, of dopamine is having a relationship to then the crash or the fall of dopamine. And importantly, notes that that fall is below the baseline that was had prior to whatever it was that stimulated that elevation. So you begin to create these new baselines that are lower than the prior baseline. And then, of course, you need more of that, whatever the stimulant or multiple stimulants are coming together to then rise it again. In that lowered state, and what can become a progressively lower state, of course, our feeling, our mood, our motivation can be depleted in the spirit of, lowered motivation, and then lowered interest levels in life at large, never alone specific pursuits, and even the feeling of helplessness. Well, these are, this is kind of the thematic, again, the detail you can listen to in Andrew's podcast. But when we say rising levels of dopamine, what are we really talking about? Well, there is notably a couple of parts of the brain that have neurons that are secreting and being receptors to the secretion of dopamine. And it happens by one neuron into the gap between that one neuron and the next neuron, or that synapse that we refer to that gap as. And that second neuron basically receives and is a reception, and it binds, the dopamine binds to that second neuron, and that then what triggers the stimulation. And where this happens in the brain is around those centers involved with motivation and seeking for rewards in life at large. And what are the things that stimulate those neurons and stimulate the release of this dopamine into that gap, into that synapse? Well, there can be activities like exercise, and different intensities of exercise can stimulate this more or less. There can be environmental things like bright lights, screens of a PC or of a phone. Also gaming, video gaming can have a quite stimulatory effect on the release of dopamine levels. And sex. And all of these things, some of them can happen discreetly, and some of them can happen together in compound. In addition to those activities, environmental factors, and this is just a short list here, there's many more, then there is the things that we would consume, substances that we consume, sugar and different foods. And by foods, remember that even natural foods, it's not like they're a single discrete ingredient, but they're a quite complex array of compounds that make up just a single food. Chocolate, for example, high in tyrosine, a precursor to the pathway that actually the body uses to create dopamine. And then there are specific natural foods, maybe foods is the wrong word, but compounds in nature, like the velvet bean that has these mucuna purines. And this is, it has the ingredient of L-dopa, which is a precursor to dopamine. And in fact, used in the treatment of Parkinson's disease. And then, of course, you have recreational drugs, whether it's nicotine by way of smoking, and obviously things like cocaine, and then medicinally drugs like the amphetamines. And these have all stimulatory effects on heightening and increasing the release of dopamine. Now, how effectual is the stimulation of these activities, environmentals, or food substances effective in terms of being able to stimulate the release or the heightening of the release of dopamine? Well, I've kind of taken a lot of, you can research this out on the internet yourself, and I've kind of simplified this clearly, but many papers capture what is happening in this part of the brain where these dopamine neurons secreting and receiving neurons are. And music, can increase it almost 100%, not quite. Long distance running, 100% increase. Food can be beyond 100% increase. Video games, almost 200%. Sex, 200%. Alcohol, 200%. Nicotine, over 200%. And then you get into certain drugs like the amphetamines, which can be even beyond 10 times that of your baseline. And like I said earlier, if you look at different lifestyles and the personas of how people in this day and age are beginning to compound together, and again, it's not surprising because it's in our DNA, in a sense, it's in our nature to want to have that good feeling, that motivation and drive. So as we begin to get used to the use of one of these activities or substances that stimulate over time, we're going to need more of that, or we compound together multiple stimulants together to up level again and stimulate even higher, or even to get back to the prior levels of stimulated levels of dopamine release. So you'll see if you went back 10 or 15 years, most people go to the gym and they may have some music playing in the background of the gym, but they don't all walk around with headphones in. Today, that's pretty much standard practice. And then, the attachment to that of sipping on sugar and carbohydrate drinks or bars or gels or what have you during exercise, and then some type of reward at the end of exercise, whether that's in the form of a coffee or some type of high carbohydrate food substance, etc. Very common, compounding together multiple things that have this in aggregate higher stimulatory effect on dopamine release. In the work environment, of course, we're on PCs and screens and phones all day long. We're sipping on coffee and sugar, a lot of social interaction, which also stimulates, of course, the dopamine release. At night in the corporate environment, think restaurants and clubbing and things like that, not abnormal at all. And then, of course, the gaming lifestyle, it's just that raw fusion of the gaming experience itself, the lights from the PC screens, multiple screens, the coffee and stimulants, etc., the music that is played. And don't think for a moment just because the folks on a team that's playing a game are geographically dispersed. Don't think for a moment, though, that interaction they're still having through the internet via voice interaction between each other is still very much a highly interacted social experience, and all of that aggregates together to heightened dopamine levels. So with this, again, I want to just give full credit to Andrew on taking what is very complex and beginning to articulate some methods to bring a more balanced baseline. And can you up level your baseline but keep it upregulated, and can you avoid these massive swings of heightened spiking dopamine levels and then resultant crashes to formulate lower baselines? Can we avoid some of that? And again, encourage you to listen to his podcast to talk in depth about that. But there's kind of some thematics that he covers. One is about just thinking about the frequency and the timing of those activities that trigger the stimulation of dopamine. Exercising multiple times a day, and then music playing all the time. Gaming, 5 or 6 times a week we see with kids, increasingly adults, and then just constant screen time. Not just the frequency of that, but the timing of these things. Screen time before we go to bed and sleep, problematic. A lot of exercise at the end of the day can be problematic, as these things heighten dopamine when we're trying to rest. Well, then you have also the frequency and timing of some of these stimulants. Now, this is not about, winding back to zero. This is not about, if you will, avoiding the use of some of these things, coffee, tea, chocolate, obviously, and then some of these precursors that are typically had in the way of a nutritional formula, a tablet capsule, what have you. It's not about doing none of this. It's more about the frequency and the timing of this. If we're always stimulating like anything else, whether it's a muscle, etc., at some point it will be exhausted. And at some point it will push back. And that's also what we see with dopamine as you begin to have these lower and lower baselines of continuing to stimulate. And then on top of all of that is, how do we, relook at deshackling some of these multiple stimulants so that we haven't aggregated them all together and have these really pronounced elevations in dopamine because we've got the music at the gym with the sugar, and how do we begin to break this out and deshackle it? Maybe music can be played when you're just inside of the car on the way to the gym. At the gym, you're just focused on the exercise itself. Or if you're gaming, etc., do you really need to be pounding yourself with sugar in the spirit of you're actually aerobic the whole time when you're playing the game? You really just don't need the sugar. Now, these are some of the thematics to helping to smooth that dopamine levels out and to try to have a more balanced, if you will, baseline, and try to avoid these heightened spikes and crashes and lowering of the baseline. He did touch on an area which is really most interesting to us at SFuels, and that is more about, can we find a way that rather than stimulate the increase of dopamine, we can actually increase the receptivity and the sensitivity to the dopamine that is produced naturally. And by that, we can still have the improved elevation of mood and motivation and drive, etc. But we're not having these big swings of the amount of dopamine that's released and then subsequently reduced in that gap and that synapse between the neurons. And there is, and he talks a little bit about this, and that is that rather than focus, if you will, on stimulating that pre-synapse, or the neuron prior to the gap, focusing on that with stimulants that increase the release of dopamine. Our focus could be on the neuron that has the receptors to actually bind to that dopamine. And the substance, of course, that does this extremely well, it is the basis by which it works, and that is caffeine. And caffeine binds to some of the other receptors on that neuron, blocking them. And therefore, if you will, the density of dopamine receptors on that particular neuron the density is heightened. There's more of those relative to other receptors that the dopamine can bind to. And through that, we can have, a heightened level of triggering of that next neuron because more of the dopamine receptors are being bound with dopamine, and caffeine achieves this outcome. It's not increasing and stimulating the release of more dopamine, but it's increasing the sensitivity and the recepting and the binding of dopamine to that next neuron. So this is when we think about a measured approach to how we can test this for ourselves and understand a given input of upregulating the sensitivity to dopamine through caffeine is really an interesting approach that we've been looking at with SFuels by the primed product, where we haven't added sugar and we haven't added a number of those others of stimulants to dopamine, but we've more focused on the nutrient profile that supports, if you will, the increased sensitivity and the density of those receptors to actually bind with dopamine to have a similar effect. Now, how would you actually go about this? How would you dose to test this and understand it for yourself? Well, you need to test your own range, but this particular chart looks at, we talked in the last Monday Mindshares about the role of caffeine for improving fat oxidation and what's the dosage you need for fat oxidation as an athlete. Well, this chart is really looking at the dosage needed specifically around the cognitive functions. And this comes out of a 2016 paper that looked at a number of different other research papers. And they got to this range of caffeine, and it's quite a large range, but it's reflective of the fact that different folks obviously have a different ability to metabolize caffeine differently, and therefore you have this range. So for example, if you look at the top table in gray, for a 165-pound in body weight person or 75 kilograms, you would need to be in this 37.5 to 300 milligrams dosage of caffeine, which again, it's a large range. What we've done in this table below then is taken our primed product and look at for that range, how much should I be working with? What's the lower range and the higher mark, the ceiling, if you will, of the range to have this effect on upregulating your cognitive response? And this is done through this increasing the receptivity, the sensitivity, if you will, of dopamine on those neurons. So for, again, that same person, 165 pounds, 75 kilograms, between a half of a sachet to up to just shy of 4 sachets. So the reason why it's important to have this measured dose is that as whether you're career-minded folk or a gamer or even just everyday, how you're feeling, you can begin to test at what range really that most effective dose is for you from a cognitive perspective. You can also add to that other measures to get a sense for how is this affecting the sympathetic nervous system, whether that's a heart rate variability monitor that you can wear on your wrist and be looking at as you dose up and down with inside of that range. Not only are you measuring and getting a sense for your mood and your cognitive upgrade, you can also be sensing implications to your sympathetic nervous system via a heart rate variability monitor. So this is just some simple methods. Again, I want to give full credit to Andrew's work at Stanford, and again, encourage you to go and check that out. But hopefully this has useful as you think about just every day, how do we feel like a more balanced mood and motivation and drive, and keep that baseline up versus it crashing, and having ability to have that motivation and drive for the pursuits in life that we are going after. Hopefully this helps you, give you some context, some methods, some simple approaches to test for yourself and work out where that sweet spot is. Hopefully that's helpful for you. Thanks again for joining us on Monday Mindshare. Be well and go longer. Thanks again.